Hi, my name is Asher Ram, and today I am joined by Abdullah Koker, and we are the co hosts of the podcast The Second Curve. This podcast essentially focuses on the second curve of learning that people often go through in their career, along with stories and experiences that shaped who they are today. Our goal is to take these stories and share them, along with uncovering what the next big thing will be in their industry.
Yeah, so today we have Andrea. So, hi, how's it going?
Hi, very good.
Um,
Very nice to meet
yeah,
you guys.
yeah. So, just so we can get kind of a background and so the viewers can know, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, so I am a senior learning designer and I work at MIT Sloan. And right now I kind of work on strategic projects for the school that involve education and technology. So one project I'm working on is the redesign of the teaching lectern in the classroom. And so you kind of use a lot of human-centered design, maybe even some engineering design, which might come in later to see if we can get to a final product. So that's one of the things that I'm working on at Sloan. Do you want me to give a little bit more about my background, sort of,
Yeah,
how I
sure.
got
We
here?
can. Yeah, kind of like your path.
Okay. Yeah. So my path has been quite curvy to stay with the theme of the show. I actually started out studying engineering. And then when I graduated, I worked for a couple of years in Chicago. And I was actually not doing heavy technical work, but more like management type roles, like kind of like an entry level management role, and really looking more at logistics and sort of industrial design versus like engineering design. And then I found that actually to be very stressful to be like on the shipping floor in a heavy operations environment. But one of the things that gave me a lot of joy was actually working with the staff to try to make their work better, easier, and also to really value and respect the temporary staff, which are often immigrants that came to work at the company. Obviously, they didn't have the same kind of benefits as everybody else. And so I kind of already had um, a leaning in that direction. And while I was in college, I also studied Spanish. So I decided that I would take a break. I would go and teach English overseas, and then my initial plan was like, I'm going to do this for a couple of years and then I'll come back and do an MBA because that's just kind of what everybody does. And I left. And once I went overseas, I loved it so much. And I loved working with the students and I loved exploring the different countries, learning about the different cultures, learning other languages, that I decided to actually stay in education, which sometimes is kind of hard because I think sometimes people think of English teaching as sort of not a real profession. It's for backpackers only, but there are a lot of professionals who take it very seriously. They care very much about the students. And I always tried to align more with, keeping my teaching standards to those levels. And so while I was teaching, that's kind of how I got into technology and the higher education environment. This was while I was working in Vietnam. And I found that when I used technology in the classroom, the students really responded to it. It was more interesting for me and also really engaging for them. And it had a lot of benefits for them that, weren't immediately obvious. And so I decided then that I was going to do my master's in technology innovation education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And then came the hard part of thinking, okay, like what am I going to do when I graduate? And so I started to look at what kinds of roles, right, would involve technology and education. And a lot of roles that came up were instructional design roles. And it just so happened that there was an intern fair at the ed school. And the perfect role came up. There was a lady who worked at the ed school. Her name was Kristen, and she said, I'm looking for an intern. It's the first intern that we're going to have for our department, and we're academic technology. And it sounded perfect to me because I wanted to stay in higher education because I loved being close to the students. And you can't be a faculty member unless you have a PhD, obviously. And I love to teach. And so I was like, oh, okay, that's perfect. So I focused on trying to get a job and I didn't want to move again because I'd already moved to so many different countries. So I was like, okay, I'm going to take a break from moving and try to stay put. And so I stayed in the area and I worked at all of the different, not all, but most of the Harvard schools. So the School of Education, their School of Public Health, and I did some internship at the Kennedy School to try to get as much exposure as I could before I graduated and after I left to get some work and stay in the Boston area. So that's what I did was I stayed there. And then during that time, I had an interesting role that was came up through a friend of mine who was living in Vietnam. And he said, "Oh, there's this guy who's looking for somebody to work with mosquitoes. It's like some government project." And I was like, okay, like, sure, send it along. I thought it was like a Vietnamese project. I thought that's interesting. And he said, they're looking for instructional designers. And it turns out that it was like this very innovative nonprofit, public health nonprofit called the World Mosquito Program. They're mentioned in the New York Times, The Guardian, like all kinds of well known publications because they have this great method where they put a bacteria called Wolbachia into the mosquito. And then when the mosquito mates, it passes on that bacteria and it goes to both males and females. And that bacteria actually prevents or significantly reduces the spread of dengue. They've had really fantastic results in the countries that they've worked in. And they were looking for somebody to help start up a sort of like a training ecosystem to help train all of the different countries, the people that they were, the partners in those countries, on their implementation methods. And so I was like, of course. I think that sounds like an amazing opportunity because I was looking to go back to Vietnam at that time. So the stars kind of aligned. And so I went out there and I worked for them for a couple of years. I got to, it was my dream job in the sense that I was supposed to be able to travel to a lot of the countries that they worked in: India, Colombia, Brazil, and it just so happened that COVID hit at the same time. And so I didn't get to travel anywhere except for Sri Lanka right before they shut down all the airports. So then after that, it was after COVID. I think I would have liked to stay longer. COVID really kind of returned my focus to family and to being close to family because I thought I'd been away for so long that, what if something happened to my family and I was just away and I wasn't there? And so I decided to come back. And it just so happened that there was a role that opened up as an education designer at the lab, Education Design Lab in DC. And it was a very interesting role because it was focusing on talent gaps at a systems level, so like at a national level. And it was not really policy, but it was a lot more about how do you use design to design systems. And so for me, that was really interesting because I'd kind of worked at the classroom level. I worked at online programs and sort of at this program level. And now it was like a different opportunity for me to get like the full range of experience and to think about what does design look like at the system level of education. And so I had that opportunity, and that's also how I got involved with AI. So it's kind of a funny story because literally I was sitting on the couch with my boss and he said, "You're going to lead the AI work." And I said, "Okay." And, we want you to think about how would we communicate about AI. And so that's how I started the Humans of AI series, to really kind of focus on who were the people, right, that would be impacted by AI, particularly in the workforce and higher education space, and what would it mean for them. And then how could we take some of those insights and those thoughts and those feelings and think about what that might mean for the work of the lab. And then actually, to get into my current role, I started to notice that AI, I think at the system level, maybe it was like a little bit too early. And a lot of the work that was happening around AI was more at the classroom level. And so this was an interesting opportunity to come to Sloan because I could actually see how people were thinking about AI in the classroom. Like what kinds of policies were being developed, how are faculty thinking about it, how is a school thinking about it, and how are they going to integrate AI into some of the things that they did. And so this is a great opportunity because the group that I'm working with is IT. And so they're going to be very knowledgeable about the technical side of AI. And so yeah, I guess it's just kind of expanding my toolkit, but still staying within, the education and adult learning space. That was
Yeah,
very long.
and
Sorry.
yeah, yeah, very, very interesting going over like three different paths. And when we were like researching about what you do, we also saw that you were a fellow at Perplexity. You want to explain what you do, how that works and stuff for the viewers?
It was great, actually. So Perplexity offered like just a series of, it was like the way they designed it was like a learning and networking opportunity. And so you just applied to the program, and then they reached out, they gave us some communications materials, and then they had like a whole schedule of webinars, hands-on, and forums for people connecting on different topics. And it's great because I actually had a lot of Perplexity fellows reach out, and there were two guys that were also part of the fellowship that reached out that are working on a very interesting startup that sits kind of in this higher education and workforce space. And so yeah, it's been great just to kind of connect with people, learn about it. And also it was interesting because I got to see how people were thinking about AI outside of the education space, right? And also to hear from like some big thought leaders like the CEO of Perplexity, right? It was amazing. He'd just be on a webinar just like this and he'd be talking to you. You know, there was a guy, I think I can't remember his name, was like Roy. He was with Bloomberg, but some of his insights were just amazing, right? And to just be able to hear from these people who are really like at the forefront of what's happening in terms of the technology, the business, the policy, you know, it was just a really great learning experience. And then to see like how people were taking all this knowledge and like applying it to whatever projects they were working on was great.
Yeah, it's like, you're saying expanding your toolkit. It's like kind of expanding your horizons, like not just education, but getting to see how it's used in other aspects, and then maybe taking, inspiration from there and being able to apply it in the education space.
Oh yeah, I love to do that, right? As I think sometimes if our focus is too narrow, we might miss out on things that could be really innovative. And also I find it more inspiring, right? If you're always just kind of looking at the same things over and over, I don't know, it gets a little boring after a while. So you kind of want to like, you know, infuse it with new ideas and new ways of thinking.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, using, expanding your horizon, very, very interesting. And, I just want to go into the next topic and talk about, what skills carried across, your three contexts: global health, higher education, and AI. What skills do you think were needed for all three of these and helped you, when moving to different career paths?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of skill and mindset.
Mm.
And I think that the skills, one is project management and organizational skills. Oftentimes because I often work on like net new projects. So that's kind of really like the messy phase, right? Requirements aren't clear. People are not quite sure what they are doing. We don't really know what the outcome is. There's like a lot of stress because we've been conditioned to expect clarity and order, right? But in the beginning, when you're approaching a new space where maybe there isn't a solution that's already defined, it's messy. And so I think you have to have very strong project management and strong organizational skills because you kind of have to be able to pull all of the pieces together and organize it in a way that will allow a team to move forward. So I think that's actually been one of my biggest skills that I've used a lot. And then I think what it is I combine it a lot with what we call durable skills in the workforce space, but which everybody else calls soft skills. So I think a big part of the organization and the project management is having really good active listening skills. And so I combine it with note-taking skills, partly for documentation, but also because I find that when I do note-taking, it's usually a shared document so that everybody can kind of see it. It also helps to kind of check assumptions, right? And then I can use it to really dive deeper or probe or clarify with stakeholders on sort of, what their needs or their wants might be, or sometimes things that are unstated or that people are assuming, but actually you realize that, depending on who's listening and who's talking, people can actually have very different interpretations of what's being said. So that's what I mean in terms of like really listening to what each person is saying and then making sure that everybody's kind of on the same page. The other one is systems thinking. So a lot of learning, I think people kind of have the misconception that it's just like somebody gets up there, they give their presentation, and then the students have learned it and somehow they can do something with it. And that is our conception of learning. Right. But I think when you dive deep into the field, you kind of see that learning is more than just delivering content. It's about checking to see understanding. It's about giving students opportunities to apply what they've learned. And then it's also thinking about the system or the environment that students are in and how the environment contributes or detracts from the learning. And I think that's the piece that a lot of people don't think about when they design learning interventions, especially like ed tech, right? It's just like you have the product, you should be able to use the product, and then you should be able to go out and like do the thing. But oftentimes that product sits within a larger system or an environment that the student is operating in. And so that can actually enhance or detract from the learning. The other piece is the social environment, right, for students, because we know that social supports are really big when it comes to learning. If you think about all the people that have helped you, have given you advice, mentors, the resources that your parents provide for you to be able to do things, like if you didn't have those things, it would be a lot. It's not saying that you couldn't do it, but it would be a lot harder to do the things that you're able to do. Right. And so I think that's the other piece that people often don't always think about when they're thinking about learning. The other piece, because I've lived across multiple countries, is sort of like a cross-cultural awareness and cross-cultural competence, and just realizing that, you know, different countries and people from have very different worldviews and very different perspectives. And they also view their perspectives on Americans are also quite interesting, right? And so that's been kind of interesting to kind of think about, but also to see where the limits of my own thinking are, and to be open to these other ways of thinking, which again can inspire ideas, innovations, and also just challenge some common assumptions that we have kind of baked into our culture. And the last one is like a learning mindset. So if you're always in these new environments, ambiguous environments, you know, you just kind of always have to be learning, and especially working with technology. There's a new technology like every week. So you're just constantly in this space of learning and experimenting and iterating. And I think actually that's one of the things that I say it keeps me young. But yes, I'm sure there is research to support this, right? Like if you're continuously learning things, you're, you know, making new connections in your brain, keeping the plasticity of your brain. So I feel like all of those things contribute to keeping people young.
No, yeah, I totally agree. I feel like in whatever situation you're in, if you aren't learning like continuously, you know, you aren't learning new things, maybe that's when you should start to get a little worried. Like, you know, I have some catching up to do.
Yeah, definitely. Or sometimes it is that you like to feel, I don't know, like once you've kind of achieved a certain level of competence, you like kind of feel really confident, right? So then when you're put into the space, into the shoes of a beginner, it questions all of the confidence that you have, right? And that's a really uncomfortable space to be in for people, and to feel like they are not as good as they thought they were or whatever, right? But I think that that's the other thing, is just kind of sitting with that discomfort. And I know lots of people say that, right? Or get out of your comfort zone. But I think it's like being aware and acknowledging that you feel really uncomfortable, and then just accepting that you're resisting it, and then move forward anyway. And I think oftentimes too, it's not just that we feel bad, but we don't want others to perceive us as incompetent, right? So that's also like a tricky thing to balance. But I don't know. I feel like maybe as things are changing so quickly, like everybody's going to be in that space, right? So maybe we should just be a little bit easy on each other, and just accept that we're all going to be in this, what they call like a learning society versus a schooled society. So yeah, and just kind of accept that that's the space that we're going to be in moving forward.
Yeah, I think sometimes like being uncomfortable. I think sometimes some of the most learning really comes when, you know, you think you know a lot and you get put in that position where you feel stupid, right? You feel like you're back at square one and you have to redo a lot of stuff. I think if you can get really good at coming back from square one, because, you know, there's always new things that you're going to have to do. Obviously that you have the experience from learning things beforehand, and you can apply that experience to learn things quicker, more effectively. You know, maybe you know your own learning strategies or specific methods that help you. And being comfortable with, like, sometimes I know people say that, you know, it's sometimes a good thing to be the dumbest person in the room or feel like the dumbest person in the room, because that means that you have so much to learn. And, you know, like oftentimes you are a reflection of the people that you keep around you. So, you know, if you feel like you're the dumbest person in the room, you're only bound to become smarter.
Wait, are you saying that the other people around you are also not very bright?
No. As in, like, if you feel like, you know, I'm not doing enough, or everybody around me is like some big shot, whatever.
Gotcha.
That kind of imposter syndrome, when that kicks in, that can, it's like a double-edged thing. Like you have to be, obviously imposter syndrome sucks, but at the same time, if you're always talking with these types of people, like you're gonna get something. Like it's gonna rub off on you. That's the kind of thing that I was going for. And it's okay to be at square one.
Yeah, no, and I think that's great, right? Like, because then you're kind of really sitting with that discomfort. You're sitting with the imposter syndrome, but then you're also like actively taking it all in, right? And constantly reflecting. And, one of the things that I used to do, because I realized that it's through mistakes that's one of our biggest learning moments. Right. So sometimes when I was learning a new language, I would deliberately make mistakes to test to see what the response was. And, like if it was something in my mind where I wasn't quite sure, I might choose something that I knew would be more wrong than right, just to see what the response would be. So then I could learn and then sort of like gauge and learn how I might correct it or what the correct way to say something is. And so, yeah, I think just the other day I was doing like this AI agent boot camp, and I was like struggling through like reading they gave us a little task. And so I was like reading the instructions. Of course, a lot of people already knew how to use the technology. So of course I was like the new person, I was reading and then trying to follow the guy who was doing the demo, which of course was going very fast. I was like, okay, I think I'm just, so I set up my little agent thing and then I hit run and like the wheel kept spinning, no output. And so I was like, oh, okay, like maybe it's just taking a long time. It was supposed to go to, I don't remember, it was supposed to go to my email or something. And then I called the guy over and he looked at it and there were like all these little errors like in the workflow that I had set up. But it was really interesting because as he corrected the errors, and I was watching him as well, right? Because then I could see how he was thinking about it, and then I could see how he was fixing the errors. And then by the questions that he asked me, it also gave me new insights into how to think about the workflow, right? So it's almost like you get triple the learning when the guy came over to tell me. So it was really good. I was like, oh, I should have made a ton of mistakes and then they could fix them all, and then I maybe would have learned some more, from it. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just if you learn from your mistakes, ask questions, you just get so much more insight than you think you'd get. Like initially, like maybe if you just like learn something and you just go quit, but instead if you ask questions, learn from your mistakes, ask someone. I think it just helps you more, and I think that social support that you said, learning, and then also those cultural perspectives are really good skills that everyone needs to take into account. And I want to go next into mostly your first and second curve. So what are your biggest lessons from working in Vietnam on public health and then going into your second curve in MIT Sloan on AI? So basically what we're asking is, did you learn anything new? Did you have to unlearn anything? How did your perspectives change? I know you already talked about this, but can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I think maybe in terms of the curve, it's maybe not necessarily thinking about the actual job, but the kind of the thing that I was working on. So, so in Vietnam and at Harvard, I was doing a lot of learning design, right? Which is kind of like designing courses or training using technology typically. And then kind of switching to AI, which is actually some of my work at the lab, that just required like it was a whole new domain basically. And so I don't think I had to unlearn anything necessarily, but I had to learn a whole lot of new information just to kind of get up to speed. Now, and I guess a lot of people say AI, they really mean like generative AI versus like the whole field of AI, right? So I think for almost like 6 months, I was like attending every webinar because I knew I was like, well, there's probably not a lot of literature written about it. And I don't know, I probably would take in more information in the way that it comes in short bites and snippets, right? So I knew all of these things about how I would learn it and learn it very quickly. So I signed up for lots of webinars. I signed up for newsletters where I could get kind of information in very short bites. I signed up for AI topics like across the board, right? Like, so I was looking at AI and national security, I was looking at AI and education. I was and then I also knew that for me, I learn really best when I can do something or when I can interact with people. So then I started to look for opportunities where I could interact with others, like in a community of practice or something. And so that's when I joined like the Austin AI Alliance. I think I went to like a couple of meetups to be able to be around people and to kind of see what they were doing and to start talking about it. Right. And so then that way I could start to build that foundation. I went to conferences and things like that. And so then from there, I knew then that there was a lot of learning that the organization had to do if they wanted to actually do AI, right? Like if they wanted to use AI for the work that we were doing, which was in, supporting and advancing economic mobility for new majority learners, right? So there was a lot of them because we don't want to make sure that we don't unintentionally harm the learners that we're trying to serve. But then also, how do we think about how do we think about what that new technology meant within the context of the work? And so then I was able to leverage all of my learning design experience, right, to think about how do you get an organization up to speed on something like AI, and also where there may be a lot of resistance to something like AI because of how the technology was framed in the media, and maybe some resistance because people that work there were also very human centered, right? And so it kind of felt like this artificial intelligence, right, was somehow going to be replacing the people and the learners that we cared about. So there was kind of a lot going on there. And so, again, I took a systems view of it, and I set up a strategy, right, that took into account like the different areas that the organization would need to work on to be able to really set the foundation to do any kind of work in the future. It was also some pattern that I had been seeing at conferences and how other organizations were approaching the work. And so I kind of set up that like high level strategy, and then using the learning design experience, kind of brought in some training, created some communities of practice, set up an experimentation lab, and then worked on. So that was internally educating people, getting them up to speed, putting in place policy and governance, right, to protect the organization, and then thinking about how we would communicate about AI externally. So again, educating like the external audience. So in some ways it's like a different domain, but in a lot of ways it's kind of very similar. It just on a bigger scale, right? Of, learning basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting perspective. I even noted, right, you were talking a lot about the kind of systems way of thinking, and it just kind of pops in my mind, as we start to leverage a lot of AI tools more, I've seen that systems thinking and proper planning has become like all the more important, where you can get AI to do something, but you need to know exactly what you want for it to get the best response, to get the best output. You need to know about the implications of that solution that you're trying to make, and how it all kind of fits together before you just start prompting. In fact, if you've ever heard of like prompt engineering, that's a lot of the stuff that they do as well. At this point, when you're trying to make an application, it's more important to identify the requirements and everything than it is to sit down and write the code. You need to know why am I making it, for who am I making it, because then the rest can be done, or a lot of it can be done through a generative AI. And I think it's like a really interesting shift into what can like people can focus on. And I actually just had a question. As you've attended so many like webinars, and over those 6 months you really delved deep into AI and people's perspectives on it, I was wondering, what do you fear more? People who underestimate AI, or people when they put too much trust in AI?
That's a really hard one because I feel like they're kind of even to me in terms of fear levels, because both are going to happen. I think
Mm.
what worries me more is the potential devaluing of what's human, right? So human connection, like they're saying people now are not turning to their peers to ask questions. They're just turning to the AI directly to ask questions, right? Now I don't need a team of people. I just need a team of AI agents to go and do the thing for me, right? And so it's just companies are cutting jobs, at least entry level, right? So we're kind of in some ways like not investing in humans anymore. We're not investing in that human, from a work perspective, we're not investing in that human capital. From an interpersonal perspective, we're not investing in the connections and the relations that we have to people, because people are just kind of hard, right? So I'm just
Hmm.
going to go with the technology because it's easier,
Right.
right? And I think that is the thing that I'm seeing and that I think about, because I think it'll be a very lonely world,
Right.
right? If we're entirely dependent, using a technology, or we've replaced a lot of the things that we connect on as humans, or the things that the value that we bring to something, when we just kind of, offload all of it to an AI. So
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I see, especially in like the tech space, with companies almost replacing or significantly cutting down on like junior engineers and entry level positions. But it's been starting to backfire, because if you don't hire junior engineers, after your senior engineers go away, you have no senior engineers. So I think maybe some people kind of in like the over trusting, or maybe not over trusting, but like kind of riding the hype train. Companies will do this and then realize it'll backfire sometimes. I think it's
yeah.
kind of funny.
Or maybe I don't know if it's that, it's partly the hype train, but maybe also a focus on short-term gains,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
profits are going to go up, we can cut this for, and then we can see gains for like this quarter, the next quarter, even the next year. But then, like you said, when the senior engineers leave, right, then what are we going to do? Because now we just have a
Exactly.
team of AIs.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Yeah, in terms of, and also what's going to happen to students who would normally, or people coming out of college, or people even switching to a new role to be able to step into something that's entry level, that's just not there anymore.
Definitely. Like if you look at like the big, like for example, like the big four consulting firms. I mean, like now they're just not like they're cutting so many entry level jobs. Like even in this is finance like sector, even in like the tech sector, they're just cutting so many jobs. Even though like it's gonna backfire, as you said, like in the long term, but short term, they just want for now to have that gain and have like that edge over competitors. But I think like going back into like that college space of what you could do getting fresh out of college, how can you adapt in today's market? And we wanted to ask you, if you graduated today, what would you focus on and take advantage on to get ahead of today's market? And the job market, it's very tough to get jobs, especially if you're going to the tech sector, even in finance and consulting. So what do you think? What are your
I
insights
mean,
on
I
that?
commend you guys. The fact that you're doing a podcast in high school is amazing. I think I would be very stressed if I was graduating today. So the fact that you are facing it head on and you're trying to figure out what you can do, I think is awesome. I think I would maybe take a little bit of a step back, and not just on graduation, but how can you leverage the time that you are in school to your advantage? Right. And so I would say focus on going beyond what's in the classroom. Unfortunately, maybe this is not going to be pleasant to hear, but the education space just moves very slowly. Right. So for the classroom and what's happening in schools to catch up with what's actually happening out there, they're probably like a decade behind. Right. And so you have to kind of take it upon yourself to accelerate your learning. Right. So focusing on what's going on, focus on what's beyond just the classroom spaces, the learning spaces. Are there projects that you can take on? Are there, like, I think now a lot of universities have startup spaces, right?
Mm.
And I think the learning there is really deep, because you're having to do so many things to build any kind of entrepreneurial venture. And so you'll learn a lot um, about going out into the real world, because most of the real world is business, right, of some sort. Even like a university in some way has business functions, right? And so you'll kind of learn a lot about that, and then you'll have hands-on experience, because you'll actually get to apply and think about the things that you may be learning in class to something that's very real world. I would also say leverage AI, right? As you're doing it, like, okay, this is what I'm learning in the classroom, like, help me think about what this means in a real world context. Give me an example. I'm interested in consulting. Give me an example of what this might look like, this philosophical theory, or, like, how does this English literature passage that I'm reading, right? Like, how might it apply to something that I might actually have to do? right? And so like use the AI to help give you examples. In some ways, you kind of have to think about as like a learning designer, right? Like how can I enhance and amplify my learning to bolster what's maybe not happening so quickly in the education environment? And then if there are apprenticeships, if there are co-ops, if there are internships, anything where you can get your hands on, basically get your hands dirty, do some work, get that experience, because it almost feels like if the entry level roles go away, then in some ways you have to come into a job with a higher level of expertise, right? And so you have to build that expertise early on. And so ideally, colleges and high schools would almost kind of have to build that expertise up in the students earlier. But since we're in this transition phase and you guys are kind of caught up in the transition phase, you might have to do more of it like on your own. The other thing, I don't know if you guys followed the Harvard Project on Workforce, but there's an interesting report where they talked about the idea of growth roles and mastery roles. And growth roles are roles where learning intensifies over time and the wage trajectory grows over time. And these types of roles are typically like they rely heavily on judgment, on sense making, right? Really building on the experience that you've had. And those might be roles like in project management. I think even a role like as a learning designer, right? There's just a lot of expertise that you kind of build up versus something that's like a mastery role, which are often technical roles, right? So you have to have that mastery up front to be able to even do the role. But then once you learn it, there's not really much more to like learn or expand on. And so they said that the wage growth is actually limited once you have that initial, have your initial work experience, and that these roles are also vulnerable to automation. And so it might be like if you're thinking about, where should I focus my energies? Like, let's say you're interested in STEM. Are there STEM roles that are also growth focused, right? Or business? Like, I feel like sometimes a manager to me is kind of a growth role because you're dealing with people, right? And so as you gain more experience, like so many different people, they react in so many different ways, right? And you have to kind of manage that and get the work done. So I feel like that is also another example of like a growth role. And so that might be something to think about. And then maybe also thinking about which of those roles would have a heavy human element. But the other thing that I have fun doing is prompting the AI to see if it can help me predict what kind of roles might emerge that haven't emerged yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe even thinking about what kind of skills might be needed. And then maybe the role doesn't exist, but you could build the skills
Right.
in another role, right? And then be ready to move into something that like I don't know, this new role that came out, forward deployment engineer.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like it's a great role, but because it's got a technical element, but then you have to work with the client to help
Mm-hmm.
them deploy, right? And so you have to kind of almost have like an educator kind of personality with a
Mm-hmm.
technical mindset, right? So if you've had experience or one in both, right, then you can like now all of a sudden bring that toolkit to bear and like all of a sudden take on this new role.
Right. Yeah. I remember it really reminds me as you talk about this as almost like it's like a subsidized version of like generalist versus specialist, right? When you're able to do a lot of different things and be pretty good at a lot of them, then including that like human element, judgment, decision making, then there's a lot of opportunity for growth. And there's a lot of ways in which your judgment can change and you get put into so many different types of situations and have to make different types of decisions compared to a specialist role. And I remember the conversation we had earlier talking about how with AI kind of being like a specialist at your fingertips, being a generalist is going to be all the more important, and being able to leverage that specialist to do the things that you want, but still having that kind of systems thinking, because to execute it effectively, you're going to need to plan and yeah,
Orchestrate.
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So you're going to have to orchestrate all of these different experts or little AI agents. I think the only thing that is a little bit tricky, and it may be that as the AI gets better, this will be less of a worry, right? Is having the expertise to evaluate the output from the AI. And that's the tricky piece, right? Like, so if you were new to teaching, you might just say, AI, give me a lesson plan, right? And you're like, and if you didn't write the prompt very well, but you just asked it to give you a lesson plan, And then all of a sudden you go and teach it, and then most likely the class would be maybe okay or it might flop, right? Because an expert would think about other things, right, that lead to having a successful experience in the classroom or for a design, right, which you may not have told the AI, right? And also, you wouldn't know based on the output that what the AI gave you whether that makes sense or not for the class that you're teaching, right? So I think those are the things that are a little bit tricky because I found that I used AI, right, to help me work on strategy, right, for the education design lab. But there were areas like I didn't have a background in IT,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there were a lot of things around there, like in terms of protecting the systems and understanding where the data sat and what kind of data we had, that required some knowledge on my part. And I didn't know if what the AI was giving me was, is that what an IT person would say? I'm assuming so, right? But I wouldn't know where it was hallucinating and where it wasn't. And
Right.
so that one I
Yeah.
had to check with somebody else or, or you definitely have that human in the loop for some of those. But I think that's the other thing is also being aware of where you don't have the skill set so that you can identify and maybe get some expertise on it. Yeah. I think, one other piece of advice was to look beyond the US market.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And that just gives you more opportunities. And
Definitely.
there's so much competition here, and there just may be less in other countries. And also, like, you bring a lot of learning and skill sets that you could bring to another space. Right. And also, it expands your perspective. And so I just think having like more global perspective really helps you see things in a different light, right? Like when you read the news, you can think about it from a lot of these different perspectives. I often think about, when I see news about inflation, I reflect on my experience in Costa Rica where like inflation was 20% over, and I'd have to have a salary increase. And I was like, that was the first time I'd really thought about like, whoa, like I don't remember having to do this in the
Mm-hmm.
US, right? And then I realized that the US keeps inflation at like 2 to 3% every year. And that made me wonder, like, oh, like why do they do that? Or how are they able to do that? So, but anyway, it just kind of made me reflect on a lot of those things and those experiences. And also, sometimes there are really interesting work opportunities and special visas that you can get, right? Like, so you could get
Yeah.
special visa, like you could maybe extend your learning and get a master's in a different country, and then
Mm-hmm.
potentially see if you could do some apprenticeships or internships or even work there once you finish. Kind of like when international students come over here. The other one is sometimes there are also special work visas for people under a certain age.
Oh.
So, yeah, so like I think Australia has something where if you're under the age of 35, you can get like a work visa and you can go. So I knew a friend who worked on like an avocado farm or something so yeah. And then the other piece is it may be that there are high demand roles, like, so even if they're declining here, they may not be declining yet in other countries, right?
Right.
Just because I guess in terms of development, right, each country might be like the US is highly developed, but there may be countries that are less developed that might still have a need for some of the roles that might be declining here. So that's also another possibility space to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of those growth roles as well. You're able to really, get your hands dirty in so many different things in such a short period of time.
Yeah, it's great. Or volunteer, like the Peace Corps.
Yeah. I agree with like all the perspectives. I think it like connects to what you were saying before about getting that perspective when going to different countries. It's the same thing trying to get work. Maybe let's see what's happening in London, or let's see what's happening in India or Australia. Like I feel like maybe if you go there, maybe you like that more. You thrive in that environment, meet new people. So obviously, I think it's just great experience to not just look at the U.S. market, but other markets as well. And I don't know if Abdullah has anything else to mention. Do you have anything else to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is important. Sometimes, especially living in the US, going to a US high school, like we don't often think about stuff outside the US. We really don't. We think about applying to schools in the US, going to college in the US, and then getting a job in the US. We don't consider the fact that the rest of the world is out there. And, a lot of the times, if you have the means, you're able to go and see places, especially coming from America as well. With, if you have like a passport, you have a strong passport, you're able to get visas a lot of these other countries, they'll have visa on arrival. There's no friction in that end. I remember I was talking to another guy. He grew up in Malaysia, but he works here now. He works at a consulting firm. And he said, if you have a US passport, the world is your oyster. Go far, go wherever you want. And whenever you want, you can come back to the US. There's so much opportunity out there. While you're young, travel a bunch and take opportunities wherever you can find them.
Yeah, I agree. And I wonder, for example, are there even possibilities to do like startup opportunities? Actually, there was one because there was one that I saw that was very interesting where you could do design, but you work in another country on a specific design problem that they have. And you could either be coming in as a new designer or coming in as like a senior designer mentoring somebody in that space, right? So like, I'm wondering if there are opportunities like that for somebody who's coming out of school to kind of just get that exposure, right? Because I had a really good friend of mine. He started teaching English maybe when he was, I want to say he was 21, right? And so he spent probably about 5 years like teaching, traveling. He traveled all throughout the US. He worked with some of the refugees and, Syrian refugees, like just getting that really broad base before he then went back to school to then, I think he did his master's, maybe did a little bit more work and then got into like a PhD program to then focus on like clinical psychology. But he's got like that really kind of broad base, right? That's not just schooling, but like seeing like what's really out there, and then he can really kind of have those experiences in mind when he moves into like the area of expertise that he wanted to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's very, very important, what you said, and everything you said today. I think it was very insightful. We learned a lot, especially AI in education. That was the big topic for today. And how you shifted roles, your mindset, and your learning. And we really appreciate you coming on to the podcast today, and giving us and the viewers some very good insight, especially on AI, because I think it's a topic that needs to be talked about a lot. And Abdullah, do you have anything last comments to say?
I think we talked about some good stuff today. Talked about mindsets, changing how maybe we perceive some things, maybe how we're going to have to change our mindsets with AI being more in people's workflows, still keeping that kind of human touch. What is human? I think it's just sometimes important considerations that we have to have in mind because we become so focused on one or two things that we sometimes forget to step back and look at a lot of these things. So it was great, just like a great reminder, great great insight to things that, when you're just focusing on like you want to do computer science, you're just focusing on that the whole time. You never step back to think, what implications does this have? And
and also like, how is it connected to other domains, right?
Absolutely.
Like sometimes we really focus, but I think we're moving into an age where there's just so many interdisciplinary problems to solve, right? Like you can't just solve it with one domain of expertise,
so
right?
You need those interdisciplinary people to solve them.
Exactly. And I'm definitely an interdisciplinary kind of person.
But yeah, it was phenomenal conversation today. We'd love to have you on for another time if you want to talk more about maybe we could focus in on what's going on in education, if there's any new stuff going on, other domains. We can go back to mindset, anything.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah.
And I would definitely love to stay in touch because I really love the idea that you guys were using this as a way to also find out about where you should focus your efforts. So I'd love to just see what path you end up choosing and what decisions you actually make once you finish school.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.